January 28, 1944, 05:17 a.m., northern Newfoundland. The horizon was a single sheet of iron, frozen and unmoving, as if the world had exhaled and forgotten to breathe again. Captain Erich Müller of the 3rd Gebirgsjäger Division pressed his gloved hand against the frosted window of the transport sled, feeling the cold reach through wool and leather like a living thing. Snow hissed against the wooden sides, blown sideways by a wind that had crossed thousands of empty miles to greet them with the sharpness of broken glass. He had been told Canada's winter warfare units were a joke, a snow army, as one officer called them during a briefing in Norway, with a smirk carved deep into his thin face. According to the briefing, they were lumberjacks with rifles, farmers in white sheets, men who swung axes better than bayonets. They train in the cold because they don't know better, someone had said, and the room erupted in polite military laughter, the kind that hides fear under the cover of condescension. But this morning Müller wasn't laughing. The storm had risen faster than any Arctic front he had seen on the Eastern Front. In Russia, winter was a slow killer. Here, it arrived like an ambush, sudden, feral, deliberate. The sled jerked and slowed. One of the Canadian escorts raised a fist, signaling a halt. Their silhouettes were little more than pale shapes swallowed by drifting snow. Müller blinked and they seemed to vanish entirely. Only when they moved did he realize they had been there all along, crouched low, reading the land with an intimacy he found unsettling. Sergeant Wilhelm Krauss muttered under his breath, "How can they even see where they're going? Everything looks the same." Müller didn't answer. He stepped out, boots sinking halfway down into powder so soft it puffed upward like steam. The wind roared between the sparse pines, carrying with it the scent of sap and ice and something metallic, almost like frozen iron. The cold stung his lips the moment he inhaled. A Canadian corporal approached. The white hood of his parka rhymed with frost. His eyelashes were tiny needles of ice. His voice when he spoke was calm, almost casual. "Blizzard's shifting south. If we push 20 minutes east, we can reach the ridge before it closes." Müller studied him. A boy, perhaps 20, too young to have seen war the way Germans defined it. Yet there was something in the way he stood, relaxed, steady, rooted in the terrain, that suggested he belonged here more than any uniformed European ever could. Behind him, the other Canadians silently adjusted straps, tightened gloves, checked their skis with practiced motions that looked less like training and more like instinct. A snow army, Müller thought. Snowmen, snow spirits. The column began moving again, each step swallowed by the deep, shifting whiteness. Frost clung to mustaches, helmets, straps, turning every soldier into a sculpture carved by winter's hand. The cold was no longer a temperature. It was a presence. It scraped at exposed skin, pressed against lungs, whispered threats in every gust. They were searching for a downed German weather station crew, men from U-864 who had supposedly set foot ashore 2 nights prior, a desperate crossing, undertaken in the belief that the Canadian patrols were clumsy, slow, ill-prepared. Yet the patrols had vanished into the forest like ghosts. No footprints remained after 10 minutes in this wind. Tracks were erased before they were made. Krauss stumbled. A Canadian soldier caught his arm without a word, steadied him, and kept walking. Müller filed that away. No mockery, no scorn, just an unexpected quiet competence that felt almost unsettling. 10 minutes later, the sky dimmed further. Snow fell in thicker sheets swirling in vortices that obscured the tree line. The Canadians adjusted course again, navigating by cues invisible to the Germans, a break in the wind, a specific pitch in its howl, a slant in the surface of the snow. It was then that the danger revealed itself. A thunderous crack split the air. The slope to their left shuddered violently. Snow lifted like a curtain, rolling downward in a slow, massive wave that grew speed with terrifying certainty. An avalanche. Müller shouted for his men to scatter, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. The Canadians reacted first, pointing to a rocky outcrop jutting from the hillside. Their gestures were sharp, precise, urgent. They weren't running, they were guiding. Müller sprinted toward the outcrop, heart slamming against his ribs. Behind him, he heard the grinding roar of tons of snow accelerating downward. Krauss slipped, boots skidding on hidden ice. A Canadian grabbed him again, the same soldier as before, nearly dragging him upright. The avalanche hit the lower part of the slope, a white wall obliterating anything in its path. Branches snapped. Ice exploded upward in jagged shards. The ground trembled beneath them as they reached the safety of the rocks. pressed tightly against them, breath ragged. When the noise finally faded, an immense stillness followed. It felt as though the world had been muted by a giant hand. Snowdust hung in the air like fine ash. Kraus stared at the Canadian who had saved him. The boy shrugged, as if it were nothing more than helping someone step over a puddle. The joke about the snow army felt suddenly childish. They resumed the march, slower now, more aware of the terrain's silent hostility. The storm thickened, turning the world into a shifting blur of white and gray. Hours passed in a kind of suspended struggle, every step a negotiation with the elements. By midday the wind had risen to a howl, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through bone. The Germans wrapped scarves around their faces, but the cold found every gap, seeped through every seam, settled into every joint. Fingers numbed, thoughts dulled. The land began to feel endless, indifferent. The Canadians, however, moved with a strange grace. Their breath formed steady plumes. Their movements remained fluid. They paused only when necessary, communicating in brief hand signals. The storm did not slow them. It acknowledged them. Near a cluster of dwarf pines, the corporal raised a hand again. They stopped. He pointed toward a faint disturbance in the snow. A broken branch, a shallow depression, a scrap of fabric caught on ice. Traces that should have been erased within minutes. Yet he read them as if they were ink on a page. "They came through here," he said. "Last night." "How can you tell?" Kraus asked, his voice cracking from cold. The corporal didn't answer. He didn't need to. The land was speaking and he understood its language. As they advanced, the storm finally reached its full fury. Snow whipped horizontal, sharp enough to sting even through wool. Visibility shrank to arm's length. The wind rose to a scream. Time dissolved into a monochrome blur. Miller felt his legs grow heavy, his breath shallow. He realized with a quiet, unwelcome dread that this storm could swallow them whole, not with violence but with an eerie, patient inevitability. The Canadians formed a tight column, each man placing skis into the exact tracks of the one ahead, a living chain, a moving fortress against nature's assault. Müller stepped into their line, not out of pride but necessity, and for the first time since arriving in this foreign frozen world, he understood the truth. The snow army didn't fight winter. It had learned how to survive inside it. By late afternoon, the storm had grown into something monstrous, a force that moved with intention rather than chance. Snow fell in spiraling sheets, rising from the ground as often as it descended from the sky. The air was thick enough to taste, metallic, granular, bitterly cold, as if the atmosphere itself had turned against them. Captain Miller tightened the strap beneath his chin, feeling frost form instantly on the exposed metal. The Canadians adjusted their pace again, leaning into the gale. Their parka hoods snapped in the wind. Their snow goggles, rough and improvised with narrow slits, were rimmed with ice but never seemed to betray their sight. They strode ahead with a certainty that defied the white chaos around them. Their silhouettes flickered in and out, ghost-like, swallowed and returned by the storm. The Germans followed in a ragged line, no longer military in posture, but simply human, hunched, fatigued, stripped of the decorum that filled officers' lounges in Oslo and Tromsø. The cold was in their bones now, radiating a dull ache with every step. Breath came out in short, ragged bursts. Frost clung to the inner edges of collars, freezing stiff the fabric that brushed their cheeks. Hours blurred. Time inside a blizzard had no shape. It stretched and collapsed unpredictably. At one point, Kraus asked how long they had been walking, and Miller realized he had no answer. The storm had stolen the day's sun, and with it the markers of progression. Light and shadow were indistinguishable. Just when the cold began to settle into panic, quiet, intimate, dangerous panic, a Canadian lieutenant halted the group with a short whistle. They gathered around him, forming a loose circle that the wind tried relentlessly to tear apart. He pointed to a ridge barely visible through the swirling white. Then he lifted his chin toward something none of the Germans could see. "There," he said. "Smoke. Smoke." Miller squinted, forcing tears from his eyes as the wind knifed across them. There was nothing but white. But a few seconds later, the storm shifted just slightly, like a curtain pulled by an unseen hand. And in that fleeting slit of visibility, he saw it, a faint, vertical smear of gray rising into the whitening sky. Thin, hesitant, almost apologetic, yet unmistakably there. A signal. The crew from U-864 had lit a fire. "Move fast," the lieutenant ordered. The Canadians pushed ahead with renewed purpose. The Germans trailed as best they could, stumbling through deep drifts that reached their knees. The terrain pitched downward, then up again in steep, jagged waves. Scrub pines appeared and disappeared. Ice-coated branches whipped their faces, stinging and sharp. Snow swallowed their boots, then released them reluctantly, as if the land resented their intrusion. The smoke thickened as they approached. Soon the faint crackle of fire broke through the storm's low roar. A shape emerged, a crude lean-to of branches half buried in snow, illuminated by the trembling glow of a small, wind-beaten flame. Two men crouched beside it, wrapped in blankets that were white with frost. They looked less like soldiers and more like survivors dredged from a shipwreck. Faces hollow, lips cracked, eyes bloodshot. Their uniforms bore the insignia of the Kriegsmarine, but the cold had erased all distinctions of rank or pride. "Gott sei Dank," one of them whispered when he saw the patrol. His voice was thin, barely audible over the storm. The Canadians knelt immediately, checking pulses, examining frostbite, offering water and something warm from a steel flask. Their movements were urgent but careful, practiced with the precision of men accustomed to rescuing more from nature than from enemy fire. The Germans from the sled unit joined them, kneeling in the snow, but their aid was clumsy, hands shaking, eyesight blurred, breath shallow. Cold had taken more from them than from the men they came to save. One of the stranded sailors, a weather technician named Otto Heller, looked up at Muller with cracked, swollen eyes. "We thought the storm would kill us," he said. "We couldn't tell which way was land and which way was sea. Everything was white, endless." He paused, shivering violently. "But they found us. How? How did they know we were here?" Muller didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the Canadian lieutenant who was adjusting the fire's positioning, shielding it with a curved wall of branches as if sculpting shelter with his bare hands. How indeed. The storm growled again, louder, deeper. Snow came harder. The world shrank to a swirling dome of white noise. The lieutenant stood, brushing ice from his gloves. "We can't stay," he said. "We move now." The Germans exchanged glances. The idea of moving through this blizzard seemed insane, but the Canadians were already preparing the stretcher. They lashed branches together with rope, layering them with blankets, sealing gaps with snow to insulate the base. A trick ancient as the land itself. Snow as protection, not threat. The Germans watched with the vague awe of men witnessing a craft long forgotten by their own culture. The storm intensified as they lifted the first sailor, then the second. The wind hammered the trees overhead, sending showers of ice cascading down like shrapnel. The snow no longer drifted. It struck, horizontal, relentless, as if the air had grown claws. They began the return march. Step, wind, step, white, step. Silence that wasn't silence. The Canadians rotated positions every few minutes, the front man breaking the wind, others following in formation. Their efficiency was not militaristic but ancestral, the shared knowledge of people born in a land that respected no one, and rewarded only those who listened closely to its moods. Muller fell into rhythm behind them, watching their boots disappear into snow, emerge, disappear again. The stretcher-bearers moved as one body, perfectly timed, as though following an invisible metronome buried beneath the ice. Kraus stumbled once more. A Canadian steadied him again without acknowledgement, without even looking at him. Not enemy, not ally, just another man in the storm. Darkness fell without ceremony. Night arrived as if someone had extinguished the sky. The temperature dropped so sharply that the air itself crackled against exposed cloth. Snowflakes hit skin like sparks of electricity. The Germans' morale thinned as quickly as the day's light. Thoughts spiraled inward. Every step became a question. Every breath tasted like fear. But the Canadians pressed on, led by a corporal whose pace never faltered, whose orientation never drifted. The storm was not an obstacle to him. It was a map he could read in real time. Hours later, how many, Muller couldn't say, they reached a narrow river frozen over with a glassy sheet of ice. The corporal knelt, placed a bare hand against the surface and listened. Actually listened, ear near the ice, eyes narrowed. Then he nodded. Safe. And they crossed. The Germans stepped uncertainly. The Canadians walked with confidence born from winters spent reading the world with senses sharpened by necessity. The blizzard roared on, trying to swallow the sound of boots scraping against ice. Lights flickered in the far distance. Faint, flickering lanterns marking the checkpoint at the forestry camp that served as their staging area. Civilization, warmth, life. The sight broke something in Muller. Relief flooded him so abruptly his knees weakened. He wasn't sure if he sighed or sobbed. The Germans trudged forward. The Canadians slowed, not out of exhaustion but because they had reached the end of their worry. They had known they would arrive. It was the Germans who weren't sure. As they approached the camp, the blizzard finally began to ease, not ending but loosening its grip. The wind softened. The snow shifted from knives to dust. And Muller realized the truth by the way the Canadians carried themselves. Upright, unshaken, quietly proud. The Snow Army wasn't surviving the storm. It was mastering it. The forestry camp came into view not as a single structure but as a cluster of lantern-lit silhouettes, rising slowly from the storm like a small island surfacing from a white sea. Pine smoke curled from a chimney, torn apart by wind before it could rise more than a few feet. The faint glow of lamps flickered warmly through slits in log walls. It looked impossibly modest, just a scattering of cabins and storage sheds. Yet in the storm it felt like a stronghold, a beacon, a promise. The Canadians led the group past the wooden gate, its hinges groaning from ice. German boots clacked on the frost-coated planks. The sound, sharp and foreign, felt jarring after hours of moving through nothing but the muffled crunch of snow. The storm still howled behind them, but inside the perimeter, the trees broke enough wind to allow a moment of breath, a moment where each man could finally feel his lungs expand without being stabbed by frozen air. The stretcher-bearers carried the two rescued sailors directly into the main cabin. Miller followed, brushing heavy frost from his sleeves. Heat hit him like a wave the moment he crossed the threshold. The air smelled of pine tar, damp wool, and something simmering on a stove. Soup or stew, impossible to tell, but heavenly nonetheless. The sailors were laid near the fire, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. Steam rose from their clothes as the ice melted. A Canadian medic knelt beside them, checking circulation, warming their hands between his own. His movements were so gentle that Muller, watching from the side, felt a strange discomfort. Not shame exactly, but something adjacent. A quiet realization that these men treated even their enemies with a kind of calm professionalism he had seen only in field hospitals far from the front. Outside, the storm battered the cabin walls, rattling the window panes. The wind's roar seeped in through the smallest cracks, creating a distant, constant moan that felt almost alive. It was nature's siege, relentless and patient. Inside, silence grew among the Germans. Some stood awkwardly near the doorway, their faces pale, their posture stiff. Others moved closer to the heat, stretching icy fingers toward the flames, watching their skin shift from white to red as sensation returned in sharp, painful pulses. Kraus sat heavily on a wooden bench, removing his gloves with trembling hands. His knuckles were swollen, raw. He rubbed them slowly, wincing. A Canadian corporal approached and handed him a tin cup filled with something steaming. "You'll need this," he said. Kraus stared at him for a moment, unsure how to respond. He had spent years being told what enemies were, always defined by hatred, always simplified into faceless threats. Yet here was a man offering soup without hesitation, as if the storm had erased the idea of sides altogether. Kraus nodded and accepted the cup. The corporal moved on. Miller walked toward the fire, watching the logs crackle and collapse inward. Sparks floated upward, glowing briefly before dissolving into the warm air. He hadn't realized how deeply the cold had settled into him until heat began to unwind it from his bones. His jaw stopped clenching, his shoulders lowered, his breath slowed. A Canadian officer entered the room, stamping snow from his boots. He carried a map rolled under his arm, its edges stiff with frost. When he spoke, his tone was measured, devoid of triumph or disdain. "You found them," he said simply. The lieutenant who led the patrol nodded. Storm tried to bury them. The officer scanned the exhausted faces in the room, German and Canadian alike, and then set the map on the table. He unrolled it with slow, deliberate care. Under lantern light, terrain lines shimmered faintly, marking ridges, frozen rivers, tree lines, and danger zones known only to those who lived intimately with winter. "This blizzard isn't passing," he said. "It's getting stronger. Temperature is dropping fast. We can't move until morning." A murmur passed through the Canadians. For them it was merely logistics. For the Germans, it was dread. Morning? The idea of sleeping through this storm felt absurd. The officer seemed to sense their unease. He pointed to the back of the cabin. "There's space in the bunkhouse. Cots, blankets, and enough heat to keep frostbite away. You'll be safe." Safe. The word struck Muller with a dissonant note. War had distorted the meaning of safety for him. Safety was temporary, conditional, unpredictable. Yet here, offered by a supposed enemy, it felt strangely real. Before any of them could respond, The wind blasted the wall again, the force vibrating through the floorboards. Snow sifted in from the windowsill, carried by a draft too persistent to block. The officer continued calmly as though the storm were merely a familiar conversation partner. "Get your men settled. You'll need the rest." The Germans filed into the bunkhouse. It was dimly lit, the ceiling low, the walls insulated with straw and tarred canvas. Rows of cots lined the room, each with folded blankets and rough wool pillows. A cast-iron stove in the corner radiated a steady, comforting warmth. The Germans removed their boots reluctantly, fingers stiff, movements clumsy. Some muttered to themselves about the cold. Others said nothing, lost in exhaustion. The cot springs creaked under their weight. Blankets were pulled close to chests, faces buried in wool. Muller lay on his back for a long moment, staring at the wooden rafters. Shadows flickered across them, cast by the stove's fire. Outside, the storm raged with the fury of a starving beast. Inside, the air hummed with quiet breathing, the occasional cough, the distant whistle of wind squeezing through cracks. He closed his eyes. Sleep did not come easily. The cold had left a residue of tension inside him, a leftover instinct that refused to fade. His mind replayed the trek, the avalanche, the endless white, the Canadians reading the land with senses he didn't possess. He felt the helplessness of it all, a vulnerability deeper than he cared to admit. Sometime in the dead hours of night, he awoke. A faint blue glow seeped through the frosted window. Moonlight filtered through the storm. The wind had calmed just slightly, enough for silence to settle between its gusts. The air smelled of smoke and pine and damp wool. Miller sat up, rubbing his eyes. His breath created soft clouds in the cold pockets of air that clung near the floor. He noticed something then. A Canadian guard sat near the stove, half asleep, coat draped over his shoulders. His rifle rested against the wall, untouched. His boots steamed faintly from melted snow. His posture was relaxed, unthreatening. He wasn't watching the Germans. He was simply keeping the fire alive, feeding it small pieces of wood whenever it dimmed, protecting them from the cold, not from escape, not from sabotage, but from the winter itself. The realization was stark. The enemy here was not a man. It was the land, the cold, the storm, the endless, indifferent wilderness. And the Canadians understood that in a way the Germans never could. Miller lay back down slowly, pulling the blanket tighter. The stove crackled softly. The guard's silhouette shifted slightly as he stoked the fire. Outside, the wind moaned, but the walls held firm. As sleep finally crept over him, Miller held one final thought. They survived not because winter spares them, but because they learned how to listen to it. Tomorrow, the storm would test them again, and he wasn't sure his men were ready. Morning came without sunrise. The storm's tail still dragged itself across the sky like a wounded creature refusing to die. Pale gray light seeped into the bunkhouse, cold and diffused. It felt less like dawn, and more like the world reassembling itself after being erased overnight. Captain Miller rose from the cot with stiff, reluctant movements. Every joint felt brittle. The air was sharp enough that even inside the cabin, breath lingered in pale ribbons. The Canadian guard from the night before was gone. The stove glowed with a renewed fire. Someone had tended it quietly while the Germans slept. Someone who understood that the border between life and death in this land was measured in degrees, not bullets. Outside, the wind had calmed, but the world left behind was unrecognizable. Snowdrifts towered taller than men, sculpted into smooth curves by the storm's breath. Trees bent under the weight of new ice, their branches creaking like the hulls of old ships. The camp, once scattered and small, now appeared half-buried, a temporary settlement swallowed by an indifferent wilderness. The Canadians were already moving. They checked gear, strapped snowshoes, adjusted straps, and prepared the rescued sailors for transport. Their motions were quiet, deliberate. There were no orders barked, no frantic urgency. Winter had taught them patience, and obedience not to rank but to nature. Miller watched them for a long moment. Their efficiency was the kind that came not from discipline, but from generations of learning how to survive a land that showed mercy to no one. They didn't resist the environment. They cooperated with it. He found himself envying that strange, elusive harmony. The lieutenant approached him. Frost clung to his hood, glittering like silver dust. "Storm's fading," he said. "If we start now, we can reach the main base before nightfall." "Will the trail be passable?" Miller asked. The lieutenant's lips twitched, almost a smile, almost a warning. "We'll make one." The group departed minutes later. The cold cut through the air with renewed sharpness, but the wind had softened to a dull hiss. Snow crunched underfoot with a satisfying heaviness. Every step sank deep, but the Canadians broke the path with practiced rhythm, carving a trail through drifts that swallowed their knees. For hours, they moved through a world remade by the storm. Hills had become white dunes. Riverbanks vanished beneath sculpted ridges of ice. The forest was a labyrinth of bowed trees and wind-shaped hollows. Nothing looked familiar. The storm had redrawn the land. The Germans followed silently, humbled by the immensity around them. They stumbled more often now, not from fatigue alone, but from the eerie stillness. The way sound seemed trapped beneath the snow, the way the landscape absorbed every footstep. It felt as though they were walking inside a memory rather than a place. At midday, clouds thinned enough for a sliver of pale sun to appear. Light sparkled off the drifts, creating a blinding brilliance that forced the Germans to shield their eyes. The Canadians, used to this, moved with confidence. For the first time, Muller noticed the subtle network of signals they exchanged: taps on shoulders, short whistles, gestures curved by cold, stiffened gloves. Their communication was as fluid as snowfall, forming a language built on necessity rather than regulation. By late afternoon, the trail narrowed. The group approached a gorge, a shallow, frozen channel flanked by boulders crusted in ice. The storm had filled the passage with deep, uneven snow. Crossing would be difficult, but turning back was impossible. The lieutenant motioned for two men to test the depth. They sank almost to their waists. A murmur of concern rippled through the Germans. If the snow hid weak ice beneath, the gorge could swallow a man whole. Yet the Canadians didn't hesitate. They grabbed long poles, probing the ground with firm, confident jabs. The sound of cracking echoed faintly, but the surface held. "Single file," the lieutenant ordered. "Step where we step." They crossed slowly. Snow shifted beneath them, but the Canadians' trail held. Muller felt the tension build in his chest, a quiet, coiled fear that the land would suddenly reveal its claws again. But they reached the far side safely, boots scraping onto solid ice-laced rock. As they climbed the final slope, the wind changed, just slightly but unmistakably. A softer note threaded through it. The trees ahead thinned, light brightened, and then in the distance, barely visible through the drifting haze, Muller saw the faint outline of buildings. The main base, the journey's end. A warmth he hadn't expected surged through him. Relief mixed with something deeper, something quieter. Not gratitude, not triumph. Recognition. This land had judged them. It had measured their limits, and only the Canadians, the so-called Snow Army, had the language to answer back. When they finally reached the base, lanterns glowed along the perimeter, flickering gold in the dimness. The rescued sailors were rushed inside. The Canadians dispersed with the same quiet efficiency they had shown from the beginning. No celebration, no boasting, no acknowledgement of what they had achieved. It was simply another day in a land where survival was routine. Muller stood at the edge of the compound, staring out at the storm-bitten wilderness behind them, a vast white expanse that still seemed to breathe. Snow drifted lazily now, falling in slow, deliberate flakes. Kraus approached him, his voice low, hoarse from cold. "They're not soldiers," he whispered. "There's something else." Muller didn't respond. He didn't need to. A nearby Canadian stepped into the snow, lifted an axe, and began splitting wood with quiet, steady motions. Each strike echoed against the frozen forest, sharp and rhythmic, a sound older than any war, older than any nation. Muller watched him for a long moment. No medals, no ceremony, just a man working with the land instead of against it. He exhaled, the breath curling into the cold air. The axe rose, the axe fell, and the sound carried through the silent, indifferent wilderness.